Hey, welcome to Vector Wonderland, the big geometry notes course.
Sponsored by the CinePack, more on them later.
I'm glad you joined us in part 1. In this part we will look at the basics of geometry notes. So grab your food, grab your drinks, and let's light our first candle. Shall we? Welcome to the first episode of Vector Wonderland. You are here for learning geometry notes? No problem. In this episode we will look at the basics of geometry notes. And here are some examples of what others did with this crazy powerful system. And without further ado, let's get started. So at first we have to open Blender version, and for this I will go into the Blender launcher, which is an application you can download also. You can just Google it. It shows you the newest builds from the Blender Foundation, but you can also go at the website blender.org, the main website, and you can go onto downloads, and here you can download new Blender versions. In this tutorial series, which is called Vector Wonderland, we will use the 3.4 Blender version, because there are some new things with the viewer that we will use. It's still experimental, so for this on the website you have to go onto experimental, and here you can download the 3.4 release candidate it is currently, but maybe you watched the video and the 3.4 is already out. It depends on where you watch this tutorial. Then you can just go onto Blender or use an even higher version. But everything above 3.4 should be working. On the Blender launcher, you can download it by going daily and downloads, and here should be the 3.4 version. You can download this if it's not out yet. We can launch this new version of Blender, and then we will explore what geometry notes is. Here we are on our home screen with little sprite fright looking at us. We can click that away. And here is our default scene. We don't need any of this, so we can delete the camera, the light. And now we have our default cube here, and we can use that as a demo. But at first, you may be wondering, what is geometry notes? So for that, we can go onto the wiki of Blender, and here they tell us geometry notes is a system for modifying the geometry of an object with node-based operation. It can be accessed by adding a geometry nodes modifier. So it's a modifier. What can geometry nodes modify? It can modify types of geometry like meshes, curves, point clouds, volumes, and instances. We will learn more about them further in this series. But for today, we can close the wiki. So they told us geometry nodes is a modifier. So where can we find it? Maybe some of you know it, but in Blender we have modifiers here in the modifier tab with this little tool icon here. And here we can add modifiers that manipulate our geometry. For instance, we can add more geometry onto our cube with a subdivision surface modifier that even smooths our objects. These are modifiers that manipulate our geometry. But so they told us geometry nodes is a modifier, so we can look here. Is here the geometry nodes? Oh yes, here we have geometry nodes, and we can just add it to our cube. But what is that? I mean, what's that? So please calm down. I haven't added information to our geometry nodes modifier yet. How can we do this? So at first, we can look at the similarities between shading nodes and geometry nodes, because both are node-based systems, and maybe you know a little bit about shading nodes. This is where you can manipulate the shading of your object via a node-based system. You can find it if you drag this window here up and we go into the shader editor. Here we have our material, principled BSDF. So it's a default material, but if we don't want to have a material, so our object is completely empty, so it has no material, we can see here this has no information and we have to open a new node tree. We can open that and it already default creates the principled BSDF. You maybe know this, but in geometry nodes is rather similar. So we have here our, I deleted it. We have here the geometry nodes modifier. So you can just search it again, geometry nodes modifier. And this is one way to create a geometry nodes system. If we hit new, like we did in the shader nodes, we can add a new geometry nodes system. And now you can see still didn't change anything, but we have to still use the geometry node window for this, similar like in the shading. We can use this window here, but we can also use the shader editor, and it is similar in the geometry nodes modifier. We have to also use the geometry nodes editor. It's above the shader editor here, the geometry nodes editor. And here we can see we have already some kind of node tree. But at first, I can show you a second way of creating geometry nodes. So here we have our geometry nodes editor here on the bottom. And we don't have to search for the geometry nodes modifier here in the modifier tab. We can just hit new on our object and it already creates automatically the modifier for us because geometry nodes is a modifier. And now we can see here we have some kind of a node tree. So you also can close this window here by dragging this all the way to the right. We don't need it today, but you can also use the shortcut N that closes it also. And now we can see we have this very simple node tree here of a group input and a group output. And this little wire here, or also called noodle, is connecting those two. But what does the group input and the group output mean? So at first we have our mesh data here. If we go into edit mode, we have our mesh data. And this mesh data gets imported out of the group input node. This mesh data then flows here in our noodle into the group output. And if it is flowing into the group output, it gets displayed as geometry in our viewport. If we will take our noodle and plug it out, we can see it's gone. Our mesh data is still there, but it isn't connected to the group output, so it doesn't get displayed in our viewport. Now, of course, we want to connect it again. And the whole purpose for this is we have our mesh data flowing in here, and we can manipulate our geometry on the way until it gets passed out and viewed in the viewport. We can manipulate our data there. And we can do similar things then in the modifier tab. For instance, let's create a little modifier stack here that we then recreate in geometry nodes. So let's delete our default cube, and we want to use with Shift A, you can add a new mesh. We can add the monkey, the Susan, and we can use that. This is as our base mesh, and now we can create a little effect here with the modifiers. I'll just drag the geometry nodes window down so you guys can see a little bit more. So here we can use, for instance, we can use the triangulate modifier. Then we can use split edges. Where is it? Edge split here. And after that, we can use the subdivision surface. And with this, we can create really cool effects like this. And this is also something we can recreate in geometry nodes. Maybe also add another thing. We can add solidify. And this is a really cool effect. You can also change the threshold of our edge split. And yeah, we can do that with the modifiers. But we now want to recreate this within our geometry nodes modifier. So for this, we can delete our modifiers. And now as a refresh, how can we add a new geometry nodes modifier? At first, we can click on new if we are in the geometry nodes editor here on the bottom. We can click on new, or we can also search here for the modifier, geometry nodes modifier, and click here on new. For this, we of course also need the geometry nodes editor. So in here, we want to begin creating something that affects our geometry, and we want to recreate our modifier thing that we did here on the right. So at first, we have here our geometry flowing in this cable or noodle, or whatever you want to call it. It's up to you. We can add things in between to manipulate our geometry. But how can we add those things? There are two ways. We can go here on the left top into the add, and here are a lot of menus where you can add nodes, and those nodes manipulate your geometry. There's also a shortcut for this. I will mainly use this. It is Shift and A. With this, you can also go into the menu. We want to at first use our subdivision surface modifier. And luckily, there's also a node for this. Not all modifiers are in geometry nodes. At the moment, more are coming, but they are not all inside of geometry nodes. But geometry nodes has also a lot more things than the modifier. But those things we did are in geometry nodes. Let's add a new node, because we want to now subdivide our monkey inside of geometry nodes. How can we do this? Of course, we want to add a new node. And here we are now in our menu, and I give you a little tip. The subdivision surface is in the mesh submenu. And here on the top, we have the subdivision surface. A second tip, you can also add a new node and go into the search menu. And here you can also type subdivision surface. So subdivision surface is the node that smooths also your mesh. Subdivide mesh is just subdividing your mesh. But we want to have the subdivision surface, and we can use this. But now you can see, what? It doesn't affect anything. And this is because our geometry is still flowing outside of the input into the output. And this node isn't connected to anything. So we have to connect our mesh data that is coming here into the mesh data from the subdivision surface modifier. And we want to output this into the group output so it gets displayed. Now we can see, yes, it's working. So every node has to be connected and has to be in the flow of geometry. We also have here the edge crease, which is a little advantage over the modifier. Smooth your edges a little bit. You have also the vertex crease. But let's go a little bit into the UI and the navigation of geometry nodes. Let's drag this window here a little bit up. How can we navigate through geometry nodes? With the scroll wheel, you can zoom out and zoom in. You can add new nodes as said with the Shift A shortcut. Another thing is, if you want to disconnect your subdivision surface node from this connection, but you don't want to plug this out and then plug this in. So by holding down the Alt key, you can drag your node out of the connection. And you can also, by holding down the node, you can move it. And if you hover over our connection, you can see it's going white. And this means you can connect it in here. Another thing is where you can move it, you can hold down G. And now you can also move it. Here on the top, we have the grid. So you can snap your nodes to the grid in the background. We have also a shortcut for this. So if you hold down Control, you can also snap it to the grid, and if you don't hold Control, it's free again. Here on the top right, we have a lot of things that you can show. So if we connect it here again, we can turn off the wire colors. So now all the noodles are gray. So this is something that you might use. And here on the bottom, we also have the timings. It shows you how fast your node can operate. And this is basically the main things you need for manipulating, for navigating through your geometry nodes. If you are very far away and you want to zoom in on something, you can select it via this box here. And then you can press on the right on your keyboard, you can press this little period key and it automatically zooms to the node you have selected. But other than that, you don't need more. So now we want to recreate our modifier setup. How can we do this? We can delete our subdivision surface and we can snap it out of our connection by holding Alt. And you can delete it. And the first thing we did triangulate our meshes, our faces, sorry. And we did this by using a triangulate modifier. And now we can search for in here. So we can just try, here it is, triangulate. And remember, we have to snap it into our connection here. So it gets executed. Now we have triangulated our mesh. The next thing we did split our edges. So we can search for it again, split edges. And we can snap it behind the triangulate, because geometry nodes is always thinking from left to right. So from the group input to the group output. You can think of it as the group input is the top of the modifier tab and the group output is completely the bottom of the modifier tab. So if we have the triangulate first, it will be also first on the modifier tab, for example. So now we have split our edges after triangulating our mesh. So the next thing we did subdivide our mesh. So we can search it again, or maybe if you know it, it is in the mesh submenu here, the subdivision surface, and we can use that on here. And the last thing we did is we used the solidify modifier. We have this also in geometry nodes. It's called a little bit different. It is when you add a new node. It is also in the mesh submenu, the extrude mesh, because we want to extrude the faces outwards. So we will grab that. And you can see it's a little bit messy. This is because you have to drag the scale a little bit down, and we want to extrude them a little bit to the outside like this. And this is looking nice. And now you can see you can also manipulate your mesh in edit mode again, the original mesh, and you can see it gets also changed in our geometry nodes tree. So now we have a lot of steps in our geometry nodes system here, and geometry nodes of course has some limitations. For instance, you can't animate empties or other object outside of geometry nodes, for instance a camera. So if we want to add a camera, we can do it here. We can't add a geometry nodes tree, but if you want to have really cool camera animations in your scene that make that what you did really cinematic and professional, this is the point where the sponsor of this video comes in, because this video is sponsored by the CinePack. The link is in the description. It will also help me a little bit out. Take a look at it. What is the CinePack? The CinePack is a collection of really cool pre-made camera animations, and we can check it out here real quick. So if we select our monkey here and we want to have a really cool cinematic camera movement or animation, we can go here on cinematic, and then we can click on here, and here we have really cool and professional animation. For instance, we can use a crane shot from the side, and then we can click on import, and we can go onto our camera and we can play, and now we can see we have this really cool cinematic looking animation. You have to also imagine a really cool scene. It's a little bit weird scene, but on a really cool scene, this gives a lot to your craft. You can really make your scenes look professional with this add-on. Here's another example of how a scene can look with really good camera animation that you can achieve with this add-on. So this is a very successful add-on for camera animation, and as said, the link is in the description if you want to check it out. You support me also a little bit with it. There are also way more animations that I didn't show you. In the extra we have also some lighting setups, so a 3-point lighting that looks like this. So you don't have to create it on your own, just import it. We have also a cable cam. This is a really cool thing where you can your camera's direction like this. Let's close this beautiful add-on and let's focus again on our geometry nodes. So now we are here on our geometry nodes editor, and we can see we made this little cool setup that lets us create this really cool looking effect. Imagine we have a little bit more things in here, and we want to now look at the state after the triangulate. Then we would have to connect this noodle into the group input, and we have to look at this. So how does this go, and what does this do, and what does this do? So we have to always reconnect this. But for this we have a viewer, and we can use this by pressing down Ctrl and Shift simultaneously and then clicking on left click on your node. With the viewer you can look at different states of your node tree by just holding Ctrl, Shift and left clicking on this node. It's really handy. And the viewer also takes the information, transfers it to another window that I would get into now. We have also for geometry nodes, we have another window called the spreadsheet, and the spreadsheet shows you everything the viewer sees. So every data that goes into the viewer is displayed in the spreadsheet. So here we can see it shows you everything the viewer node sees. We can also look at the original, which is the group input, or the evaluated, which is the group output, I believe. Correct me if I'm wrong. But we now want to look at what the viewer node sees. And here we can see after the triangulate, we can see every position of every vertex on your mesh, which is crazy. But we can also see edge data or face data. We have also the Boolean output of which faces are shaded smooth. Currently none of them are shaded smooth, or the normal information or the face corner. The other things, we don't have them right now in our node tree, so there is no data there. With the viewer node we can see the data which is flowing in our noodle here. And you can see if we change this, also our data is changing, so you can see roughly 3K edges, and after the subdivision surface we have 30K. The viewer displays what is currently in your node tree. But now we want to move on to a new section of geometry nodes. We have now looked at how to recreate our modifier stack, but now we don't want to use our group input anymore. We don't want to use this weird Susan with those weird box here above. We want to use an icosphere. So we don't want to use here add an icosphere and recreate this again. We want to use an icosphere inside of geometry nodes. So how can we do this? If we want to add a new node, pressing Shift A, we have here in a new section the mesh primitives. And here we can add procedural meshes. Procedural means that in any time you can always change those parameters again. So in here we for instance want to use a cylinder, and you can plug this in between here because this is only an output. It doesn't have a mesh input because it doesn't manipulate your mesh. It is an own mesh, a cylinder. we want to delete our group input and we want to use the cylinder instead. And now we have our effect on the cylinder. Isn't this nice? But now we want to also use it on an icosphere simultaneously. So for this we can add the icosphere by going into the mesh primitives and then icosphere. But now we can't use two at the same thing, you can see it. So we have to join them. How can we do this? There's a node for this. So we can press Shift A again. And in the geometry submenu, we have the join geometry node, but you can also search it. So join geometry node, and we can plug it in between here. And we can join those two meshes together. And now you can see the icosphere is here in the middle and they get joined, and then our modifier tree here gets executed on them both. So with this join geometry, you can join several objects or meshes together. And of course, it's procedural, so you can change every parameter here on the fly, and it's really crazy. And also on the icosphere, of course. But now we want to move our icosphere here above the cylinder. How can we do this? We have to transform our icosphere. There's a node for this. It is also in the geometry submenu, the transform node. And we can want to use this after the icosphere because we want to put our icosphere first up and then we want to use our effects on it. So by moving something up, you can use the translation, and we want to move it up on the z-axis like this. And with this node, you can also change the rotation of something. You can also animate it. Here also the scale. So we have come pretty far in this first episode of Vector Wonderland. We will look at more, of course, in the second episode. So see you there. And if it's still very mind-boggling for you, you can join my Discord server and we can help you there a little bit out. And if you want to support me, of course, you can click the link in the description of the sponsor. I'll get a little bit of money from that. And you can check that add-on out. It's really great. Thank you all for watching. See you hopefully next time.
Ho ho ho! These were a lot of new things we've learned. Maybe experimenting in geometry nodes your own until next episode might be a great idea. In the next episode we will take a deep dive into geometry nodes and we will learn a lot more. And we will make our first snow animation. All that in the next episode of Vector Wonderland.